Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and if you know me, you know I love looking at long lists, best of lists, all of that. One, to see how many of the books I've read, of course, because don't we all have a lot of fun with that as readers? I certainly do. Also, as tools of discovery to see if there are books that I might have missed, and also to maybe challenge my perception of some books that I had previously passed on. So, The Times released the 25 best novels of the 21st century, and this is specifically British and Irish fiction. So I should clarify that right up front, because although the article is called the 25 best novels of the 21st century, they are specifically referring to Irish and British novels and novellas and all of that. So there you go. So I want to go through this list. I have taken a peek at what is on this list, and I've pulled copies of the books on this list that I have so I can hold them up. But I have not read their blurbs. And part of the reason I haven't done that is that there are a lot of books on here that are new to me, or by authors that I am vaguely familiar with, but have not read. So I want to be as fresh as possible to go through those descriptions and see if these are things that I would like to add to my own personal TBR. And the books that speak to you off of this list, or that you have loved off of this list, might be different from the ones that I have loved, or the ones that I want to read, and that is fine. That is totally fine. And I'm not attempting to review these books. I feel like I always need to mention that because people kind of assume that that's what I'm doing. And no. I am merely reacting to these books, celebrating or, having complicated feelings if I have read the book. And otherwise, I'm just talking about my own interest in reading it. And again, your interest might be different from mine. So we have 25 books to look at. And before we dive in, the only other note, and by the way, I should also mention that there will be links to all of these books in the description box down below. You can use those links to purchase a copy if you would like. Otherwise, you can go to your local independent bookstore or your library. Some of these, I'm willing to bet, are not going to be available in the United States. So if they're not, I won't have a link to them, but it's fine. You can probably figure out a way to get these books. All right, so they did note that they limited themselves to writers from Britain and Ireland, which we talked about, and they said we've chosen no more than one novel by each writer, mainly so that our list couldn't be confused for a Hilary Mantel bibliography, which, is fair, because I don't even know how to begin separating out the books in the Wolf Hall trilogy or her other books. And so obviously you can tell they have picked one of those books, and we'll talk about that book and what I think of the one they chose, because I have read all of them when we get to it. So they present the titles from oldest to youngest, but they save their 5 favorites for the end. So when we get to the end, there will be a ranked top 5. And that's all of the note that I feel like we should cover before we dive in. So let's jump in. The first book, and again, since we're going oldest to newest outside of the top 5, we are beginning in the year 2000. And the first selection is White Teeth by Zadie Smith. Here's what they say about this. Hitting shelves in January 2000, and therefore eligible for our list by the skin of its teeth, forgive the pun, Zadie Smith's debut novel captures Britain at the start of the new millennium. Fast-paced, noisy, multicultural. Even more impressive is that Smith was only 24 when it was published, having started writing the book at university. She had the good fortune to sit beside Salman Rushdie at a dinner party, who read it, loved it, and hooked her up with an agent. I had never heard that story before. That's wild. Who can say that as an origin story for a successful writer? Wow. Spanning 25 years and 560 pages, the State of the Nation novel tells the story of Archie Jones and Samad Iqbal, whose paths first cross in 1945 during the war and later realign when they become neighbors in northwest London. Smith has had plenty of bangers since, but this is what put her on the literary map. That note that she's had other bangers is interesting, because as I was reading this, I was thinking, this could have been another scenario where an author might have had more than one books, because Zadie Smith has published a lot of books since then. And a lot of those books have been pretty widely celebrated. So it's sometimes difficult in that circumstance to pick one book. And I will say the book that I always hear the most about is White Teeth. That seems to be the book that people keep going back to from her bibliography. And for that reason, I don't feel entirely surprised, although it does feel that there are other directions they could have gone in. I have not read White Teeth. I do feel like I need to do it at some point. I will admit I have been reluctant to do it in print, partially because of the size of the book, mostly because even as someone who doesn't really concern himself with the size of the print in a book, the copies that I have seen have very tiny type. And that makes me think maybe I shouldn't do this in print. Maybe an audio would be better. And I just haven't really sought out the audio. There is also part of me that questions, they describe it as a state of the nation novel. Well, I'm an American, so how much of a state of the nation novel set in the year 2000 would just go right over my head? I do want to read it, but I think those are the things that have been holding me back. Clearly, there's something here and I need to read it. And if you have thoughts about this book, please let me know in the comment section down below. If this is something you think I should prioritize and try to get to sooner rather than later, if you have listened to the audiobook, if you've read the tiny print in all the versions that I've seen, let me know your reading experience as well in the comment section. In the meantime, let's just go to the next one, which is also from the year 2000, and it is The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. If I was going to read a children's or young adult fantasy series, I do feel like his Dark Materials would be at the top of the list. The only problem is I did read the first book, and I think I read the second book in the series before I had a BookTube channel. And I thought they were good. I didn't fall in love with them the way so many other people have. Maybe I think I did go through a period where I read a bunch of, the fantasy novels that were coming out in the wake of that other series that I'm not going to talk about. And maybe I got a little burned out on them. Who knows? For whatever reason, it just didn't land with me very hard. Certainly not in the way that it has landed for a lot of other people. But anyway, here is what they say about it. And I know I am in the minority about this, and that is fine. Everybody who enjoys his Dark Materials can keep on enjoying his Dark Materials. I might go back and read the third book, which is, I believe this is the third. I could be wrong about that, though. But I could be convinced to go back, but at this point, it's been long enough that I feel like I would have to reread the first two, and that holds me up a bit. Here's what they say. The Amber Spyglass was the first children's book to be longlisted for the Booker Prize. I actually didn't know that. And it deserves to be read by old and young alike. While the essential story of two people from different worlds, Will and Lyra, who fall in love, might sound familiar, Pullman was inspired by Miltonic philosophy, astrophysics, and Christian theology. I should also note, I am someone who is really not into philosophy. I took philosophy classes in school. I enjoy the basic theories, but the second you really get into a conversation about it, my brain just wants to shut down and be bored. So that might be another thing that was a bit of a barrier for entry. Philosophy is just a difficult sell in a book for me. So maybe that is why I struggled with the His Dark Materials books. Anyway, in this fast-paced conclusion to the His Dark Materials trilogy, so I was right, Will and Lyra must venture to the land of the dead. They come to understand the depth of their feelings for each other and why they must sacrifice their relationship for the good of mankind. It's heartbreaking. Quote, and when we do find each other again, we'll cling together so tight that nothing and no one will ever tear us apart. Every atom of me and every atom of you. End quote. So if you have read His Dark Materials, including this last volume, let me know in the comment section. Here is one of the books that I'm completely unfamiliar with, and an author I don't think I have ever heard of. It's English Passengers by Matthew Neal, published in the year 2000. So this description is going to be my very first experience of this book and this author. Let's dive in. I live for this. An eccentric vicar, in thrall to ludicrous speculations, believes that the Garden of Eden is located in Tasmania. Being an intrepid Victorian fellow, he sets off to find it on a ship crewed by Manx smugglers and accompanied by a surgeon with rather disturbing scientific racial theories. Yes, science proves the British are superior. Of course, this madcap adventure to the other side of the world won't end well. The English passengers get odder and odder. The story is told through the eyes of 20 or so characters, many of them deluded, grotesque, or dotty. One of the narrators, though, is a native Tasmanian, and we see the lethal undertow of British colonialism. Despite that dark shadow, the novel is also very funny. This winner of the Whitbread Prize is historical fiction at its most imaginative. That does sound interesting. Obviously, the sentence about the surgeon who believes that science proves that British people are superior, like, that immediately gets my hackles up a bit. But the fact that this is taking a bit of a satirical approach and that these characters are depicted as deluded, grotesque, or dotty, and maybe unreliable, I would be curious to look into this a little bit more. I don't think I would immediately commit to reading it. I think what I will do is, if you've read this book, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section. And I am going to look at reviews and see what other people are saying about this book. And maybe read the actual description of the book on bookshop.org and see where that takes me. But I definitely think I would be interested in this book. I just need to do a little bit more due diligence before committing. That takes us to Any Human Heart by William Boyd. This was published in 2002. I feel like I am familiar with the name William Boyd, but I can't think of why at this moment, so let's just go right into the description. It can be a privilege to follow a character from cradle to grave, and in Any Human Heart, William Boyd makes Logan Mountstuart feel like a dear friend. These are his intimate journals, beginning in 1923 when he is a schoolboy, worried about exams, meeting girls, losing his virginity, and continuing as he goes up to Oxford, mopes around in Paris, marries, has a child, and has his life utterly changed by the war. Perhaps the most accomplished sections of the novel, though, come toward the end, as Logan descends into the indignities of impoverished old age, at one particularly memorable point resorting to eating dog food, quote, with the liberal addition of some tomato ketchup, end quote. It also has liberal additions of that thing so many great novels forget to include: humor. Humor is a great selling point for me. That also sounds really interesting, the idea of tracing someone's life and catching up with them in old age and how things have changed. I think this is in the same place as English Passengers for me. I welcome comments about the book and feedback, but I am going to look up other reviews and I'm interested. I just need to do some due diligence. The next book is actually the first one that I have read and have a copy of. It is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. I purchased this book when it was first released in the United States, and you can kind of tell that this is old because, a little context, back around the time this was published, Oprah had temporarily canceled her book club. She said she wasn't going to be doing it anymore. She later revived it, but in that in-between period where she said she wasn't going to do it anymore, and when she came back, a lot of TV shows tried to jump in and fill the gap, and the Today Show was one of them. Now they have a book club in a very different format, but this is from that brief period when you had Today's Book Club, and this is a first edition, but it still has, that's not a sticker, it's on the cover of the book. Anyway, I remember really liking this book. I have not read it since it was published, but I remember really liking it and the perspective that it offers from the character. I'm sure we're going to get into it when we look at their description of this book. There was a play that was adapted out of this book, and I have never seen it, but I would be very curious to see how they take this story and adapt it for the stage. And huge trigger warning, the incident of the dog is that a dog was murdered. And if deaths of animals is a trigger for you, it wasn't as much of a trigger for me back then. It bothered me, but I had not had a dog myself at that point. So I don't know how that would land with me now. Like, if that would be a much more difficult hurdle. I read it before it really became a thing for me. But I remember really liking this book. And it's not a book a lot of people talk about anymore. So I'm kind of glad to see it get a mention here. Here's what they say. Not many books begin with the brutal murder of a hound with a gardening implement. Quote, it looked as if it was running on its side, the way dogs run when they think they are chasing a cat in a dream. But the dog was not running or asleep. The dog was dead. There was a garden fork sticking out of the dog. End quote. So if you've made it through that sentence, you might be able to make it through this book, but it's making me squirm a little bit. So if you also have that, problem you look for that trigger warning in books, it might be a difficult read. Anyway, which is perhaps why Mark Haddon's clever murder mystery stands out as one of the most fantastically original books of the past couple of decades. It's narrated by a puzzle-obsessed 15-year-old with Asperger's syndrome, who doesn't like strangers or the color yellow or being touched. Chapters are labeled with prime numbers instead of a normal 1, 2, 3. We were flabbergasted that it didn't make it past the long list of that year's Booker Prize. And that also sounds a bit surprising to me. It does seem like the type of book that can't say what the competition would have been for that year, but it does feel like it would have merited a spot on that shortlist. Maybe not necessarily one, but shortlist for sure, because it is a very original, inventive, and creative book from what I remember. And therefore, I think it's worthy of being on this list. So that's the first one I've read and the first one that I own. The next one is another book that I have read, but I don't have a copy of it, and I can't remember if I had owned a copy and lost it somewhere along the way or if I got it from the library. Point is, I read it. It's Notes on a Scandal by Zoe Heller. This was published in 2003. I believe I forgot to mention when The Curious Incident was published, and that was also 2003. Zoe Heller's ingenious psychological thriller about a student-teacher affair was inspired by W.H. Auden's observation that the desires of the heart are as crooked as corkscrews. The story centers on two very different teachers working in an Islington secondary school who develop an unlikely friendship. Barbara is a dowdy history teacher who lives alone. Sheba is a posh new pottery teacher who puts her family, career, and social position in jeopardy when she starts sleeping with a 15-year-old student, Stephen Connolly. What makes the whole sordid affair so layered is that it's narrated by the bitter and twisted Barbara, who is convinced that Sheba's interest in the boy stems from her surprise that anyone from a deprived background might be interested in art. This is a technically brilliant piece of character-driven fiction about class, obsession, and betrayal. I really liked this book a great deal. I think it was also longlisted for the Booker Prize, possibly even shortlisted, but I can't remember. Don't quote me on that. It didn't say it here. But I remember thinking it was fascinating because there's also a bit of a lesbian angle to the book. And there was a film adaptation with Judi Dench as Barbara and Cate Blanchett as Sheba. And they were fantastic. Both of them were Oscar nominated for it. So the movie adaptation, from what I remember, I haven't seen it since it came out, was great. And although I haven't read the book since it was published in 2003, I remember it also being, as they say, a really spellbinding piece of character-driven work. Obviously, there's plot in this book because there's a lot to talk about. But it's really Barbara who is kind of obsessed with Sheba, and then Sheba who's doing this thing with the student, that drives the story and makes it so intriguing. So again, I can't argue with this book being on the list. The next book is called 1983 by David Peace, and it was published in 2003. This is another book that I have not heard of. I don't think I've heard of David Peace either. That's why I enjoy doing these lists. Show me another book I didn't know about. The Red Riding Quartet, 1974, 1977, 1980, and 1983, is an extraordinary work of imagination. It is David Pearce's nightmare vision of his home county of Yorkshire in the 1970s and 1980s, a brutal place of cheap lives, casual violence, corrupt cops, and sleazy cover-up. The four novels are fictionalized accounts of the bungled investigations into the killings of the so-called Yorkshire Ripper, who was convicted of murdering 13 women. Peace's insistent, driving, aggressive, expletive-heavy prose makes the reading experience similar to being bog-washed by the author, and this final installment is unforgettable, truly bracing, and an antidote to nostalgia. That does sound interesting. This is definitely a place where I would look for feedback from you if you have read this book, because I tend to be a bit of a completionist, which is funny because I don't really like committing to series books a whole lot. But at the same time, if I'm going to read a book that's like the fourth and final, I would feel like I need to go back and read the others, 1974, 1977, and 1980. So tell me, if you've read 1983, would you get enjoyment out of just reading 1983? Would you recommend going back to the beginning and working through the series? Or is it something that you think I can pretty safely skip and maybe focus on some other books that are on this list? Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. All right, the next one is Mother's Milk by Edward St. Aubyn. We have moved into 2006. I have heard of Edward St. Aubyn. I've never read any of the books, and to be honest, I don't really know what any of them are about. So let's take a look. Edward St. Aubyn's semi-autobiographical quintet about destructive parents proved that deep psychological pain can be horrifically funny. The fourth novel catches up with a middle-aged Patrick Melrose, who was raped at the age of 5 by his father, as recalled in his first book, Nevermind, from 1992. Now a wealthy barrister recovering from heroin addiction, Patrick finds his wife Mary consumed by motherhood and his dying mother about to hand over his inheritance to a New Age foundation. Meanwhile, he is struggling with his own feelings about child rearing. Looking after children can be a subtle way of giving up, Patrick reflects, having been ousted from the marital bed by his son. The part of oneself that's fighting against decay and depression is transferred to guarding them from decay and depression. In the meantime, one decays and gets depressed. I don't know that my anxiety would survive such trauma, with a sense of humor, although it sounds a little bit like it's kind of dark humor. I don't know how that would go. I've heard good things about Edward St. Aubyn's work in the past. This is kind of in the same scenario as the other one, though, where if this is the fourth novel about Patrick Melrose, I would feel like I need to go back to the beginning. And by the time you get to a fourth book, maybe that's a lot of misery. So I'm not disinterested in it, but I do feel hesitant, if that makes sense. So I'm going to rely on anyone who has read this book, because is it a lot of misery? Would it trigger my anxiety? And again, is this something where I would be able to read this book and not go back and read the others, or would I have to start at the beginning? Let me know. And then we can move on to the next book, which I have not read yet, but there's a whole story with this author. This is Brooklyn by Colm Tóibín, and this was published in 2009. Colm Tóibín had been one of the authors that I have wanted to read every single year and somehow had not gotten to. I finally managed to read one of his books in June, and that was Blackwater Lightship. That was what I had decided I wanted to be the first book by Colm Tóibín that I read. Brooklyn is pretty likely to be the next one. So now that I have caught up to the Blackwater Lightship, I can eventually get to Brooklyn. Here is what they say about it. It would be criminal to exclude Colm Tóibín from any list of the greatest modern novels, but picking which one of his impressive backlist should represent the rest was tricky. Nora Webster, The Master, and Long Island, one of those rare sequels that manages to live up to the original, are all powerful reads. Ultimately, though, the Irish author's touching 2009 novel Brooklyn comes out on top. It's a heartbreaking story set in the early 1950s of an Irish girl on the edge of adulthood leaving her home in County Wexford to forge a new life in Brooklyn, New York. Once settled there, she finds a new American kind of happiness for herself, but must make a terrible choice when tragic news calls her back across the Atlantic. With a plot that rich, no wonder the film adaptation received 3 Oscar nominations. And I did see the film adaptation. I don't remember it because I saw it with my mother, and my mother got really offended by the movie. And I don't think there were really any grounds. So when I do read the book, I will be going in fresh. Yeah, Colm Tóibín, absolutely another author who has built a massive list of books that could be considered for something like this, so I'm not surprised that they had that difficulty. The Blackwater Lightship was published in the 1990s, so it would be ineligible for this list. And absolutely, I want to read Brooklyn. I'm kind of even hoping to do it this year, but I don't know if that will work out. We'll have to see. Saoirse Ronan, who played the lead in the film adaptation of Brooklyn, has released a recording of the audiobook, and honestly, I think that is going to be the way I go, although I do have a copy of the book. So we'll see when I get around to it. The next one is A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Eimear McBride from 2013. Now, this is a book that a lot of people have recommended, and I've heard a lot of really good things about. I have always felt a little bit hesitant because even the people who recommend it kind of say it's really dense, and that makes me feel like maybe it's a bit of a project book. If you think that's an unfair depiction of this book, let me know, but that is the thing that has really held me away from it. Here's what they say. We'll level with you. Eimear McBride's debut novel is not like reading for the sun lounger. A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing is formally and linguistically experimental and frequently disturbing in subject, but it's so good that you should read it anyway. Narrated by an unnamed young woman, it tells the story of her relationship with her younger brother, who was born with a brain tumor, and with her own body molded as it is by the religious and misogynistic world in which she grows up. McBride's writing is like no one else's, and encapsulates the life of the female body with brio. Tired, undertouched, flesh having run all night after the cows, flesh carries sacks of turf up lanes from the shed, and spurt out child and child and child. I mean, that quote does sound really interesting. And like I said, I have heard really good things consistently about this book. It's really just the fact that even people who like the book say it is dense that has held me off. Is that something I should get over? Let me know. The next book is one that I recently got a copy, earlier this year, got a copy of. It's Outline by Rachel Cusk, which was published in 2014. This is a book that was recommended to me by a bookseller at Elliott Bay Book Company in Seattle. When Joel and I were there earlier this year, I managed to have time to talk to an employee and get some recommendations. I told him a bunch of books that I liked and told him about some of the things I liked. And one of the things I said was, kind of like Demon Copperhead, I like books that have a lot of empathy. And he said, based on that word, empathy, he recommended this one. So I haven't read it yet, but I am looking forward to reading it based on that bookseller's recommendation. Here's what they say. About 10 years ago, Rachel Cusk abandoned the witty, assured social realism that had characterized the first half of her career and instead took her cue from the autofiction of Karl Ove Knausgaard. She used the struggles and existential angst of her middle years to create her own literary form, plotless, semi-autobiographical accounts of one woman's conversations with friends and strangers. This woman is a divorced middle-aged writer, Faye, who has lost her belief in reality and acts as a quasi-passive receptacle for other people's stories of catastrophes, epiphanies, and transitions. Outline was followed by Transit and Kudos, forming a trilogy in which Faye eventually reattaches herself to life. Cusk's autofiction was recognized as a new path for the novel, transforming her into one of Britain's most celebrated modern writers. So I look forward to reading that, and if you've read it, I'd love to hear what you thought of it. The next one is The Green Road by Anne Enright, published in 2015. I have not read this book, and I have two books by Anne Enright, just not this one. I have the book that she won the Booker Prize for, The Gathering, and I have the, what is the one, her more recent book is The Actress? Just sight unseen, not having read the description yet. I feel like I would be more likely to read one of the ones that I have, but I'm going to keep an open mind because Anne Enright is an author that I would like to read. So let's see what this is. It was The Gathering that won Anne Enright the Booker, but we have a soft spot for The Green Road, her novel about the Madigan family's not very happy Christmas. Each of the children is struggling. Hannah with alcoholism, Dan with his sexuality, Constance with illness, and Emmett with heartbreak. We meet each of them one by one, and then together when their mother, Rosaline, decides to sell the family home and invites them back for one last festive meal. There are some fantastically lurid scenes of last-minute Christmas shopping at the height of the Celtic tiger boom. Constance bought a wheel of camembert, various boxes of chocolates, Parma ham, and beautiful small grapes. and a moment of real terror when Rosaline runs away on a stormy night. And that does sound really good. So now I feel conflicted. Which Anne Enright book should I read first? Do you think I should do The Green Road? Should it be The Gathering? Or whatever that other book that I have is? Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. The next book is another one that I have a copy of but have not managed to read yet, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. It's Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, published in 2016. I got a copy of this a year or two ago and haven't managed to fit it in to my reading work yet, but I'm really looking forward to it, and it is constantly in my pile of possibilities. It just hasn't made it to the book that I read. Here's what they say. If you love a novel with sweep, incident, and emotion, then this is the novel for you. We see a still young America through the eyes of Thomas McNulty, who arrives aged 17 in the New World after escaping the Irish famine. He falls in love with John Cole, and at one point the two lads work as a drag act out west in a vaudeville theater, catering for women-starved men. Thomas never loses his penchant for cross-dressing, even as they sign up, fighting in the American Civil War and then the bloody campaigns against Native American tribes. But it's not a war story, it's a love story, as brothers in arms become something closer, lush and full of loveliness. I did not know the drag act angle, but I knew the rest, and I can't wait to read this. I'm hoping that it will be soon, that I manage to get around to it. Now we have another book that I have been totally unfamiliar with, so this is going to be my first experience of it. I don't even think I know who the author is. It's Golden Hill by Francis Spufford, published in 2016. Spufford's literary page-turner, his debut, was championed by the Sunday Times and became a runaway bestseller. He only started writing novels at the age of 52, by which time he wanted to throw in everything I liked and then the kitchen sink. The result is a madcap caper set in mid-18th century New York that follows Richard Smith, a fresh-off-the-boat ingenue from London, who arrives with a bill of exchange for £1,000 and experiences Manhattan in its infancy. It reads like all the best bits of Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson, Tobias Smollett, and Lawrence Stern. Spufford is the master of the set piece, the party, the punch-up, the duel, the bathhouse romp. His great skill is to breathe life into almost any scene with apparent ease. I think of the ones that I'm unfamiliar with, I would gravitate toward some of the other ones first, but that does sound interesting. So if you have feedback on it, let me know what you thought of it and if it's something that I should consider a little more seriously. But I think I would veer toward the other new to me books first, so far at least. Now we have Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney, published in 2017. I have read this book and I appreciated the craft of the book, but I didn't really enjoy the book, if that makes sense. So I admire Sally Rooney as a writer for the way she structured the book, but I didn't like the book. So eventually I traded it in at a local used bookshop. I feel pretty convinced that Sally Rooney is an author who is maybe not entirely for me, but I appreciate her and all the people who love her. So that's my experience. Let's see what they say. We know that Normal People is Sally Rooney's most widely loved novel, but we're standing firm on our position that her debut, Conversations with Friends, is even better. It takes as its subject a quartet of people. Frances and Bobby, two young women studying at Trinity together, who used to be in a relationship, and Melissa and Nick, a married couple in their 30s. When Frances and Nick begin an affair, all four hurt each other in increasingly baroque ways. Rooney is fantastic at understanding the anxieties and frustrations of youth and the particular pain of heartbreak. Quote, "At times I thought this was the worst misery I had experienced in my life, but it was also a very shallow misery, which at any time could have been relieved completely by a word from him and transformed into idiotic happiness." End quote. And I think in that sentence you can see, I admire what Sally Rooney does as someone who crafts words on a page, but I did not really enjoy the book. Now we get to another book I have but haven't read, The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. The only Pat Barker book I have read is Regeneration, and I haven't finished that trilogy, and I feel like I would really like to do that before I would do this. This was published in 2018, by the way, and the Regeneration trilogy was all published before the year 2000, so it would have been ineligible. Here's what they say. The first part of Pat Barker's Trojan War trilogy brilliantly subverted the traditional tale of heroism and glory by focusing on the brutal consequences on the women and girls enslaved in the Greeks' rape camp. We follow Briseis, the watchful 19-year-old queen of Lyrnessus, I apologize for my pronunciation, it's not good, who is forced to become the warrior Achilles' bedgirl, mere hours after she has witnessed him butcher every man in her family. The warrior grabs her chin and says, "Cheers, lads, she'll do." The book is full of this kind of modern, unvarnished Anglo-Saxonism. Published at the height of the Me Too movement, Barker's electrifying 14th novel became a bestseller, proving that a story about the Bronze Age could hold up a mirror to our world in which women are still treated as prizes of honor. Sounds really interesting. I look forward to reading it at some point. All right, now we have another book I'm completely unfamiliar with by an author I don't think I know. It's Now We Shall Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller, published in 2018. Now that I've said the name again, Andrew Miller, is that the Andrew Miller who's on the current long list for the Booker Prize for The Land in Winter? It may very well be. So let's read this and find out. This cat and mouse thriller set at the height of the Napoleonic Wars is one of the most underrated British novels of recent years. It's 1809, and John LaCroix, a wounded British officer in his early 30s, is guilt-ridden by memories of war atrocities committed in Spain. Instruction comes for John to return to his regiment, but wondering whether he has lost some common invisible thread of sense, he flees to the Hebrides. This is a novel of delicately shifting moods, a pastoral comedy, a passionate romance, and a story of murder. There's even a trippy scene involving laudanum. Andrew Miller, who last month was Booker longlisted for The Land in Winter, pat on the back to me, which is set in the 1960s, is one of those rare novelists who can rock up in any time and place and convincingly inhabit that particular historical moment. I feel like I would need to catch up to The Land in Winter first, but that does sound interesting. I just think, especially with the urgency of the Booker long list, that would be the way to go. But if you've read Now We Shall Be Entirely Free, let me know what you thought of it, because that sounds really interesting. Now we have Milkman by Anna Burns, published in 2018. When I was reading Irish books before going to Ireland, this was the most recommended book to me. And I did start it on audio. I got 2 chapters in and put it down for now. I don't think it was a permanent DNF. I just got tripped up because the first chapter was fascinating to me, and then the second chapter turned the story in a kind of different direction, and it put me off. It felt jarring. So at some point I need to go back in and maybe I will be more prepared for what the rest of the book is. Anyway, here's the description. When Milkman won the Booker in 2018, some readers thought it was incomprehensible, with names swapped for titles like Maybe Boyfriend and Third Brother-in-Law, and places referred to in intentionally ambiguous ways. But others, and we're with them, thought it was tense, formally inventive, and all the more moving for its ambiguity. Set in troubles-torn Belfast, where everything is surveilled and nothing escapes judgment, the story is narrated by Middle Sister, an introspective young woman who cannot seem to fit into the mold society has made for her. She reads while walking, for goodness sake. I've done that. Not in a long time, but I used to do that all the time. Her life is put in peril when she comes to the attention of Milkman, a frightening and dangerous individual who didn't ever deliver milk. I know a lot of people have said that it is their favorite book of the current century so far, so at some point I will need to get back to it. I'm just taking a little bit of a break for now. And now we have Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart. I have read this book. I loved this book. It was one of my favorite books the year I read it, which I'm pretty sure was the year it was published, which is 2020. Hanky's Out, Shuggie Bain is a heartbreaker. Set in the tough universe of the working class estates and tenements of Scotland in the 1980s and 1990s, it's the story of a poor, sensitive boy and his mother, a finely drawn, tragic heroine. Her alcoholic disintegration is movingly and painfully chronicled, and there is a beauty and tenderness in Douglas Stewart's description of her relationship with Shuggie. It's not all misery. There are flashes of humor, caught in earthy Glaswegian. You root for both characters, hoping that against the odds, they find peace and happiness, that they can escape their lives, roughly circumscribed by addiction and poverty. It does what good fiction does. You walk in the scuffed trainers of people who live very different lives, a popular winner of the Booker Prize. As I said, I love this book. I do think it is heartbreaking in a lot of ways, but there's truth and beauty in this book. And I think it captures something that is very rare in fiction, and something that I have personally experienced, which is that if you are a child of a parent who struggles with addiction, most stories take the approach that there's anger and resentment, and sure, there is, but sometimes there is also really deep, profound love and a desire to save the parent, and perhaps even a knowledge that you can't save them. And I thought that was really beautiful in this book, so I would highly recommend it, and clearly they do as well. All right, next, this is the final book we talk about before we get into the top 5. It's The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, published in 2023. I know a lot of people loved this book. I did attempt the first chapter, and I knew I wasn't going to enjoy the book because I had read Skippy Dies, a previous book by Paul Murray, and I thought it was too long, and the sense of humor didn't quite land with me at all times. So even when people who love The Bee Sting describe it, it just sounds like things that I didn't like about the first book. So anybody who likes this book, I see you. I don't think you're wrong. I just know that it's not really a book for me. But for anyone out there who's unfamiliar, here is what they say. Paul Murray's tragicomic masterpiece teases out all psychic horror of family life and turns it into riotous farce. This is a mosaic-like account of one family's misery when their Volkswagen dealership hits the skids in post-crash Ireland. We plunge into the scrambled thoughts of each of the 4 protagonists: the hapless paterfamilias, Dickie, his materialistic wife Imelda, and their 2 confused children. It's a story of blackmail, betrayal, and freak accidents, but most of all, it's about what having money and losing money does to humans. Murray's 4th novel shares much in common with the big American family sagas of Jonathan Franzen and A.M. Holmes, where disaster is piled upon misfortune. As Imelda observes, life just came at you like a gang of lads getting out of a van. Let's get into the top 5. I'm really excited about number 5. This is one of my all-time favorite books, Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I know this isn't a book for everyone. The narrative meanders a bit in that way that sometimes when you're telling a story, you might digress, and that's not for everyone. Some people have read this book and felt that for long stretches, nothing is really happening. I didn't feel that at all because I really just enjoyed going for the ride and finding out where the story was taking me, and a growing sense of dread about where the story was taking me. And then you get to the conclusion, and wow, I love this book. It's one of my all-time favorites. Here's what they say. Kazuo Ishiguro's melancholy masterpiece was once dismissed as a failure by Frank Kermode, who said its Dear Diary prose would never hold the reader's interest. 20 years on, with film and stage adaptations and translations in 50 languages, Ishiguro's best-read novel, yes, it has outsold The Remains of the Day, is considered a modern-day classic. Rightly so, in my opinion. Its story will haunt you for a lifetime. The narrator, 31-year-old Kathy H., reflects on her life, fondly recollecting her time at Hailsham, a boarding school in the English countryside, where she became close friends with the controlling Ruth and the sensitive Tommy. The characters seem orphaned, but it slowly emerges that the pupils... I'm not going to say the rest of that sentence because I think that's something that you should discover in the book for yourself. Ostensibly science fiction, this heartbreaking story is really about the inescapability of sickness and death and the strategies we employ to give our limited lives meaning. It is a beautiful, beautiful book, and I would highly recommend it if you have not read it yet. And that's at number 5. Number 4 is Atonement by Ian McEwan, which was published in 2001. I did read Atonement. I remember liking it. I didn't love it, but I remember liking it. The first segment I thought was interesting, and then the second segment takes a bit of a departure, and I kept waiting to get back to the original story and more of that. And then the third segment is kind of calls back, but it's different. So I struggled a little bit, but I did really like the book. Let's see what they say about it. Few novels this century have a fraction of the emotional power of Atonement, a tale of doomed love and painful regret. In the summer of 1935, young Bryony watches with confusion as a romance blossoms between her sister Cecilia and Robbie, the son of the family's housekeeper. When a terrible crime is committed, Bryony wrongly accuses Robbie. These 3 characters continue to move uncomfortably in each other's orbit as the war breaks out, and as Bryony realizes her mistake, she knows that she has destroyed the couple's chances forever. The descriptions of Dunkirk are particularly strong. All around him, men were walking silently with their thoughts, reforming their lives, making resolutions. If I ever get out of this lot, they could never be counted, the dreamed-up children, mentally conceived on the walk into Dunkirk and later made flesh. There you go. That is Atonement. I'm excited to keep going, so let's kind of power through. Number 3 is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, published in 2021. Another one of my favorite books. And by the way, it just occurred to me, Saoirse Ronan has starred in film adaptations of 2 of the books on this list, Brooklyn and Atonement. Interesting. Anyway, Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, which also has a really great film adaptation that came out last year. And it's a wonderful book. I reread it earlier this year because I saw the film adaptation, and it reaffirmed that this is one of my favorite books. And it's a tiny little thing. You could dunk it in your coffee. You could read it in a single afternoon. I did when I reread it. Sometimes a novel comes along that proves without question that the author is a master of their craft. Small Things Like These, Claire Keegan's first novel in more than a decade, does exactly that. The tender, carefully constructed tale is set in rural Ireland during the unforgiving winter of 1985, and tales the coal merchant Bill Furlong, a gentle yet hard-working father of 5, as he makes his last fuel deliveries in the run-up to Christmas. Things take a dark turn when Furlong stops in at the local convent and finds a starving young woman locked inside the coal shed. Realizing the extent of the church's abuse of unmarried mothers, he must weigh up the cost of staying silent versus the cost of intervening. Hence the book's dedication to the women and children who suffered time in Ireland's mother and baby homes and Magdalene laundries. Nostalgic, pensive, fierce, and deeply affecting all at once, it rightfully deserves a spot in the Literary Hall of Fame. I fully agree. I know there are some people who prefer Foster to Small Things Like These, and I see why, but I am one of the people who champions Small Things Like These. Number 2 is The Line of Beauty by Alan Hollinghurst, published in 2004. I believe this was also a Booker winner. Yes, winner of the 2004 Booker Prize, back when it was known as the Man Booker. Here's what they say about it. This is one of the most brilliant novels ever written about the British class system. It has comedy, tragedy, political scandal, and drug-fueled hedonism. It even has a dancing Mrs. Thatcher. Every sentence is a work of beauty. Thatcher's Britain and the AIDS crisis is seen through the eyes of Nick Guest, a young gay aesthete who is invited to stay with the wealthy Fedden family in their Notting Hill home. Over the 1980s, the family induct him into a world of French villas, troubled millionaires, and vicious power games. Alan Hollinghurst can write about outdoor bum-shoving with a rare elegance and candor, but if you've come for the heady gay sex, you stay for the forensic dissection of the British establishment. This is a novel with a powerful political charge. Now, I read this when it came out in paperback, and it had won the Booker Prize at that point. In 2004, I was 22. Not being British, I think a lot of the politics kind of went over. Maybe this is a book I should reread, although I did really enjoy this. So I would put it on the list of the 25 best books, especially if you're thinking about the UK and Ireland. Maybe not on my own personal list, but which, by the way, I am going to be working on later this year. But I don't know if I would put it in the top 5. I do feel like I should revisit it as someone who is older, a little bit wiser, and who understands a lot more about Thatcher-era Britain in particular. Because I did really like the book, but I feel like nowadays I would be able to engage with other things about it that make it great. Number 1. You may remember that we opened with them saying that they didn't want this to be a Hilary Mantel bibliography, and that we would get to Hilary Mantel later. Well, we've gotten all the way to number 1. So which book from the Wolf Hall trilogy did they end up picking? I think they chose the correct one. Bring Up the Bodies. This is the second installment of the trilogy. Before I read their description, I want to tell you what I think of it, because I haven't read their description yet. Wolf Hall, beautiful book. I'm thrilled that I read it. It is rightly regarded as a modern classic and a fantastic book. It is very dense and difficult to get through. It requires active participation on the part of the reader, so it isn't really a fun read. It can sometimes feel like a slog, but it's beautiful. I felt very frustrated when I read Wolf Hall, but after I finished it, the more I moved away from the experience of reading it, the more I appreciated it. And there's no denying that it sets up a foundation for the rest of the series. So you kind of have to, in my opinion, get through it to read Bring Up the Bodies. You could actually read Bring Up the Bodies on its own, and that would be fine. But for the full experience, I do think you should read Wolf Hall first. Bring Up the Bodies is very different. Wolf Hall spans a lot of time in the life of Thomas Cromwell, from his childhood to when he becomes King Henry VIII's right-hand man, essentially. That's a lot of time and political maneuvering, and a lot of people named Henry and a lot of people named Thomas. This book is set in a very short time period. It is the period where King Henry VIII marries Anne Boleyn up to her execution. And it's a short, sharp shock, as another booktuber would say, and it's extremely powerful. And then the third installment, The Mirror and the Light, goes back to the structure of Wolf Hall. It covers a couple of different years and is much more expansive. So This one is the most tightly focused, and I think that does make it the most impactful. Although the whole trilogy is genius, and Hilary Mantel, may she rest, is a wonderful author who achieved something absolutely tremendous with the entire trilogy. So that's what I have to say about Bring Out the Bodies. Let's see what they say. Initially, we had Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall in the top spot, and the first in her Thomas Cromwell trilogy is definitely ingenious territory. But we think Bring Up the Bodies is even better. I agree. As it begins, Anne Boleyn has married Henry VIII and given birth to a child, Elizabeth. But when she fails to provide a male heir, Henry grows impatient. As the wily Cromwell begins to plot against the Queen, Mantel's generous, expansive narrative grows sharp. She has done that almost impossible thing to take a story that every child learns at school and still make the reader thrum with suspense. Every word of the eventual execution scene is finely tuned. Quote, "Into that silence, a sharp sigh or a sound like a whistle through a keyhole." End quote. I got shivers just from that. But most powerful of all is the conclusion, as Cromwell comes to terms with his own mortality and the likelihood that Henry will one day turn on him. There are no endings. If you think so, you are deceived as to their nature. They are all beginnings. Here is one. This is a brilliant book. Honestly, I can't argue with it. I think it is absolutely the number one book published in the UK and Ireland since the year 2000. It's tremendous, and I think they chose the right book from the series. But that's my opinion. What do you think of this list? Is there anything here that you think should have been number one? Anything you think was left out and would recommend? Thoughts on any of the books? Let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.